Alright, welcome back to part 2 of the series. So this is the Forbidden Forest that we are traveling through. So as I stated in the last part, the Forbidden Forest is a superstitious place for the Azrathians. So they call it the Forbidden Forest because they believed that if you ventured into the Forbidden Forest, you would never leave. It is unclear why they believed this, and it's also unclear what they believed was in the Forbidden Forest. This has been lost to time. But due to the Forbidden Forest being a superstitious place, the Morthanians, which in the last part I talked about, being an elf kingdom that the Azrath nations invaded in order to enslave their population, they would flee into the Forbidden Forest. Today, the Forbidden Forest does not have its superstition. The Azrathians travel through it all the time. But in the days when the Great Slave Roundup was going on, it was forbidden for Azrathians to go into the Forbidden Forest. So, I talked about in the last part that the Morthanians were either enslaved or they fled into the Forbidden Forest, and this was due to how big Morthania was. So the Azrathians primarily focused on conquering the big cities in Morthania, but there was some parts of Morthania where word got to them that they were being invaded and that they should escape, so they ran into the Forbidden Forest. So a lot of these smaller towns and smaller cities inhabitants fled into the Forbidden Forest. And they fled to a territorial town called Definer. So Definer was a territory of Authorania, and it primarily provided food for Morthania. So Morthania had a huge population problem. It could not produce enough food on its farmlands, so they began to establish territories where it would be basically just farmers, and they would use their land to farm animals, crops, etc. Well, these refugees flooded Definer, and when they got into Definer, they started to rebuild Morthania. So basically they made a Morthania 2.0. They took over the lands, they bought all the farmlands, and they started to build their own city. And sometime after the first generation of those Morthanian elves died off, a new religion was discovered called the Testamentary religion. And this started to lead to a cultural shift in Definer. And eventually, this led to Definer changing its name from Definer to Authorania, which is named after the all-goddess Authorena, who is basically the head goddess of the entire pantheon of Testamentary and gods and goddesses. So we're entering Authorania. Where we are now is called Capital City, and this is the site of Definer. So the border of Capital City is actually the old border of Definer. Today, Capital City is a religious city-state. So it has a bunch of temples and stuff like that. Capital City is a protected religious city-state, so only priests and some very high-ranking noble citizens can live in Capital City. But the ground itself, the entire border, is a religious border. So there are plenty of workers that work in Capital City, and they actually have to travel from other city-states to Capital City to work. So you can see that there is the Hall of Justice here. So Capital City is also home to all of the federal establishments. So this is where the Hall of Justice is. So this is the High Justice of the land. This is the High Court. There is a college over here. That big building is a college. And there are a lot of temples. There is a large hospital in Capital City. Residents can live here as patients in this hospital, but that is basically the extent of regular Authoranians live in Capital City. There's also a theater here where a lot of performances and debates happen. It is a half circle, it is not a full circle due to the land restrictions. There are shops here, but like I said, the citizens who actually man these shops, they must travel from other city-states. They do not live in Capital City. And here are some other temples. So for example, Temple of Shadow for the Shadow God is right here. And interestingly enough, there is a nether church. So the Testamentarians do believe in the nether, which is basically hell. And they do not oppress nether worshippers. Nether worshippers are part of a cult, so they do not actually believe in the religion the way that they should. So any cult members, they are believed to just be damned to the nether, or when they die, they will just wander the mortal world as spirits for eternity. But there is a nether church here in which you can visit the nether. So there's an incomplete nether portal in here. And you just click this button and it opens the nether portal for you. So you can go to the nether. We'll explore the nether another time. So yeah, Authorania was founded as an elf nation that would continue on Morthania's legacy. So Authorania's population is majority elf. In the early Andrilio Testament era, there was a war between the Azarath nations and Authorania when the Azarath nations accidentally discovered Authorania. So an adventurer was exploring the Forbidden Forest, and he stumbled upon Authorania. So for hundreds of years, Authorania was not known to the Azarathians, but after this adventurer found Authorania, he went back to the Azarath nations and told the leadership about Authorania. And so the Azarathians, who still practiced slavery and were extremely racist against elves at the time, they decided to wage an invasion against Authorania as basically a second Great Slave Roundup. This was called the Bloody Trees War, and it is named this because the war's front line was right at the edge of Authorania over here, right at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. And the Authoranians were so good at their defenses that the Azarathians could not push past the front lines in the Forbidden Forest, which coated the trees with blood. The Azarathians ended up losing the war, And due to the loss of the Bloody Trees War, this created a cultural shift in the Azarath nations, which eventually led to the end of elven slavery in the Azarath nations. So I mentioned the Andrilio Testament era. So the Azarath nations, due to it being in its own nation for so long, it practices its own time system. So the Azarathians, they use a time system based on their dynasties, while the Authoranians use a time system based on the Testaments. So whenever a New Testament comes out, a new era begins. So the Testament that was written by a priest named Andrilio, that was his era that the Bloody Trees War started. There's a zoo here. This is Theoden Zoo. So Theoden is a demigod of zoos. So he was an animal researcher, and demigods are a specific type of god in the testamentary religion where they used to be mortal and they did something good enough in life where they warranted becoming a demigod. So they're higher than immortals, in which immortals are just dead spirits of mortals. They're higher rank than that, but they're not as high as gods. So Theoden is one of those demigods. And this is his zoo that he established all those years ago. And there's books on each of these animals that you can read through. Over here is a school. So the college members that actually go to the college that's over there, they have to travel in to Capital City to attend their classes. But this school here is designed for residents of Capital City. So residents, which are priests who live in these houses here, their children go to this school. So it's a small little school because there's not a lot of residents. There's even more homes over here for higher ranking priests. So there's also, in the priesthood, there's plurians, which is above a priest. And then there's high priests, which are the highest priests. They are the top level priests, and they live in these more fancy houses. This is the main square of Capital City. So this was actually its own city-state, being the second city-state ever established. And it was called Hars. And Capital City ended up absorbing it hundreds of years ago. So it is one of the only city-states that was absorbed by another city-state. So I've been calling Authorania city-states city-states, but it does not mean that they are their own separate entities. City-states in Authorania's terms just means that they are states that go under the king. They have their own legislator and everything, but they all fall under the king. But due to the fact that they are just cities and are not very big, they call them city-states. So I'm looking at this building here. This is the world's library. So this is the biggest library in the mortal world. It holds all the books ever written. So we can go inside. And it is a very nice looking library. It has a big open area in the middle where a pond is. And there are tons and tons of books. So World's Library is kind of like the public-facing version of Writers Anonymous that I showed in the last part, where every book that I write, I just place them in here. So you'll have a bunch of different books in here. Now, as I said in the last part as well, I've done more writing in my wiki than I have in the actual world, so there are a lot of lore that I still need to write in books. But if you do want to read all the lore, it is in the World's Library. You'll find chests scattered about, and they'll have books in there that I've written. So yeah, these are all where the books are housed, and then if you go upstairs, there are more books, but this is where you could sit around and read. So there's reading rooms back here. And it's the same for the other side. This is Authorania's main bank. Bank of Authorania. And here's where all of the gold and diamonds, all of the citizens' currency is held. In this vault down there. And this is a big statue of Authorania. So the namesake of Authorania and the head goddess of all the gods in the testamentary religion. So anytime that there is a festival for Authorania, it happens at the base of this massive temple. So you see that there is a border around Capital City. And due to Capital City being a religious district, this land is considered Holy Land. So, any crimes that are committed here will get extra punishment, and also, this is what bars people from living Capital City. There are these gates. You are not allowed to cross the boundary of Capital City without going through gates, because it is seen as a religious taboo. So if I jump on this grass here and cross this is not considered right in the eyes of Authoranians. So you have to cross through the gates. And when you cross through the gate, if you go out of it, it's fine. But when you go into it, you must say a little prayer. And most Authoranians will say the prayer in their head. And it's considered taboo if you do not say the prayer. So the next city-state is Danes. So Danes is the second oldest city-state, and it's technically the first city-state because Authorania used to just be capital city. But once the population got too large and they needed to expand out, they developed suburbs out in this land out here, and then they ended up making it into its own city-state for population control. And that is really the only interesting thing about Danes, is that it is the oldest city-state. In Danes, there is a secret hiding spot here, so you can see a brick is out of place. Open that up. So there's a secret area, and you see over here is 3 different pressure plates, and you have to place an item on the right one in order to open the secret entrance. And this is a meeting place for the Order of the Red Skulls. So there is an Authoranian sect of the Order of the Red Skulls. Now, the Authoranian sect of the Order of the Red Skulls and the Azarathian sect of the Order of the Red Skulls are in unison with each other, but they do not like each other due to an event that happened where the Authoranian Order of the Red Skulls ended up assassinating one of the Azarathian Order of the Red Skulls members for revenge, and this did not sit well with the Azarathians. And they ended up creating sort of a schism, but they're still part of the same establishment. So let's leave this. There is a small military camp here. So this is the Vanos Jukaska Guild. The Vanos Jukaska Guild is a guild of magicians whose members are purebred, so they do not have any members that are not magicians, whose parents are not magicians, and whose grandparents are not magicians. The Vanos Jukaska Guild was pretty controversial because they do a special breeding program where they are trying to produce a birthright magician. So a birthright magician is a magician who was able to become a master magician really young at life, and this is because when they were a fetus in their mother's womb, the mother either got attacked by magic or they used magic themselves, and it ended up affecting the baby. 99.9% of the time, magic will kill the fetus or injure the fetus, but a very, very slim margin of them will actually make magic inherited. So even as babies, these babies will know magic, and they're called birthright magicians. Well, the Vanos Jukaska Guild, they do not like birthright magicians, and they're trying to produce their own by pure breeding magicians to the point where a magician will be born that knows magic from birth. So for most of the guild's existence, it was a secret. So it wasn't fully known to the general population whether the guild existed at all. New members were invited to the guild, so the guild knew who the members would be and if they were trustworthy or not to give away any secrets. But although the secrecy of the group was important, it wasn't totally necessary, as the testamentarian leadership that made them go underground were never intending to prosecute the group. But following the Blood River War, when the guild began to open up as interest in pure-blood magicians began to rise around the mortal world, the Blood River War exposed weaknesses of modern magicians, and this ended up making citizens and magicians more favorable to the mission of the Vanos Jukaska Guild of making pure-blooded birthright magicians. And Vanos Jakoska simply means pure magician. All right, so that was Danes. The next city-state that we're going to go to is Jiagnotvershire. So Jiagnotvershire is the biggest and most densely populated city-state in Authorania. So right now we are in the market. It has an extensive market. This is actually a world-renowned market. So this is the top level, but there's actually a bottom level as well. And over here is a statue. You can see that there's two statues. So there is a statue over here. This statue has its sword facing out with its shield to its chest. And then there is this statue with its sword out, but its shield to its side. And that is deliberate symbolism. So these two statues are going along the Blood River. This is called the Blood River due to the Blood River War. So the Blood River War was a war against the Kingdom of Presbytopia, which was a human kingdom, and Authorania. Presbytopia, its founding, basically what legitimized Presbytopia, was a king who came from Authorania. He was actually Authoranian born, and he was the son of a high-ranking general in the Authoranian army. And he was banished from Authorania due to wanting to assassinate the king. When he was banished across the Blood River here, so Jiagnotvershire did not exist at the time. And this was all forest, and he was banished to the forests over here, in which he found a small kingdom of Presbytopia, and then he took over the leadership, made it big, and he ended up becoming a human supremacist anti-elf nation. And he ended up waging a war against Authorania by invading the city-state of Boxer. And what happened was Boxer was so completely overrun and unprepared that their citizens were all slaughtered. Almost all of them were slaughtered. And the Presbytopians dumped the bodies of the Boxer inhabitants into the river, causing it to turn blood red, which is why it's called the Blood River. And why the war is called the Blood River War. So the Blood River War is actually a very interesting war in the history of Authorania, because Authorania almost lost this war. The Presbytopians took over all the city-states, and the front lines ended up to Capital City. But Authorania ended up enlisting the help of the Azarath nations. The Azarath nations at this time had banished slavery, but they still were iffy on Authorania. But they ended up lending aid to Authorania by sending troops, and they also sent their special warfare unit called the Knights of the Red Shield, which is a Yarn-Gradian Special Forces military unit. And with the Jernivians, which I will go over the Jernivians later when we go to where they're from, they ended up conquering Presbytopia and turning the tide of the war. And then Authorania ended up winning the war. And to commemorate that war, they built these two statues. So the statue with the shield on its chest was the original boundary of Authorania, and its shield to its chest to symbolize that it's defending Authorania. And then the statue with the shield to its side is saluting this other soldier statue with his shield to his side. And when Authorania won the war, Jiagnotvershire did start to exist, and they ended up absorbing Jiagnotvershire, and they also absorbed the city-state of Edenborough, which is another city-state I'll go over later. So Jiagnotvershire is named after Jiagnotver, which is the god of the trees. And the god of the trees is the only testamentarian god that actually exists in the mortal world. And he is over here. So we go over here, and you can see that big tree out there. That is Jiagnotver. So worshippers will go to this land here, and this park is sacred ground, kind of like Capital City is. And all of these trees are believed to be Jiagnotver's children, so you're not allowed to touch these trees. And this is where worshippers worship Jiagnotver. But we'll take a closer look at Jiagnotver. So he's a big tree, and he has a face. So Jiagnotver is not only a god, but he's also a very important type of tree. He is a Jiagnotver tree, and Jiagnotver tree is very unique in which the wood does not burn. So Jiagnotver cannot burn. And due to this, magicians make their staves out of Jiagnotver wood, because the amount of energy that goes through the staves would burn regular wood, but it does not burn Jiagnotver wood. So the reason why Jiagnotver is in the mortal world, and he's frozen like this, is because he used to actually talk. That's why he has a face. He did talk to mortals. And it ended up that mortals started worshipping him because he could talk to them, thinking that he was the god. And this angered Authorania and other gods and goddesses in the heavenly realm, who believed that he was unfairly being treated as the only god, so it made the religion monotheistic. So Authorania cursed him to not be able to speak to mortals ever again and just be frozen here. So he still exists here, but he is frozen. He cannot talk, he cannot do anything. So as you can see, Jiagnotvershirians are very into trees. And they're so into trees that they actually defend trees throughout the mortal world. They're very environmental. And it gets to the point where they actually form a terrorist unit, in which if a kingdom or city or village somewhere in the mortal world ends up doing mass deforestations, this Jiagnotver terrorist organization will actually go and destroy the village or kingdom or whatever. They just burn everything down. And due to this terrorist organization, which this is a terrorist organization to other nations, the Authoranians do not believe that this is a terrorist organization, and they actually work with this organization. So anytime Authorania wants to build something and fell trees to do it, they ask permission from the Jiagnotvershirians to do it. And Jiagnotvershirians are not against felling trees for homes and stuff like that, or burning wood. They just do not like mass deforestation. It just matters your intent. So I'm going to float, because this is a very dense city-state. We're going to go to the castle of Jiagnotvershire. So like I said, Jiagnotvershire was independent before the Blood River War. And so this is the castle of the king at the time, but now this is the castle of the head of the city-state. Here's a big study. This is a large ballroom. Here is the dining table of the castle. And here's the kitchen. And then there's a cellar below. We can go out here. It sustains its own little crop farm. I'm going to float up. There's a little balcony up here, so we can go to the second floor pretty quick. The roof is all emerald. And then here is the royal's bedroom. Some more bedrooms. Here is a chapel. So you worship Jiagnotvershire in this chapel. And back here is where the servants' quarters is. So you can see down here, this is where the servants live. So I'll talk about some behind-the-scenes building lore when it comes to this, or some building facts. So you might wonder, Authorania, which has a different language and everything, why is a tree named Jiagnotvershire? It's very much a Azerathian type of name. And that is actually because the tree Jiagnotvershire was built when I was building the Azarath nations many, many, many years ago. And I actually placed the tree where at the time was in the middle of nowhere. And I wanted it to be something that adventurers could discover by walking through the land. But when I started building Authorania, which was around 2015, I ended up butting up against the tree, and then I just built around it eventually. I've thought about changing the name, but I haven't committed to that yet. Another building fact is that Jiagnotvershire used to be called Langshire, and it was a whole different type of building style. So it used to be elevated. I wanted to make it completely elevated, in which there were these elevated platforms that you'd go to, and everything was floating above the ground. So that is why the market is on stilts, basically. It's up on top. The bottom here actually is a market too. If we go down, there are stores and stalls down in here, which are not filled in or anything, but I'll get to it eventually. But yeah, this is all stalls and stuff like that, but that's why this is all elevated. And this very odd looking building here that's useless now, it used to be a connecting platform. It's kind of a remnants of the old building that used to be here. So this wasn't stairs. It used to come out and curve around and hit this, and then there would be 4 different paths in 4 different directions. There's also some colored homes here, so you can see that this one's red and there's a blue one here, and these are also original. I did it much like Devfrerne, where I used colored terracotta, but I just ended up not liking it. I just ended up not liking it. It didn't really click for me. I really wasn't inspired. So I ended up destroying the platforms in most of the buildings, except for a few. These brick roofed buildings are also original. And I just rebuilt everything, and it came out a lot better, in my opinion. So the next city-state is Moraseau. Moraseau is the second most populous city-state in Authorania. So Moraseau used to be the city-state where the royals lived. And we'll see when we travel to it, there is the old castle. You can see it peeking over there. So this castle, which is closed down now, I'll just float so you can see it. This was the old castle of Authorania. This is where the royals originally lived when Authorania was quite young. In the later Second Testament era, there was an era called the Dark Era. And the Dark Era was started by a king who was extremely corrupt, and one of his corruptions was that he decided to not live in this castle anymore, and he decided to build a new palace called Cannerberry Palace, which is over there, and we will explore it later. But that ended up bankrupting the country, and it bankrupted the country so much that it fell into a very deep depression. And due to this, and due to failed wars, etc., the king ended up getting killed by an angry mob. This did not end the Dark Era. The Dark Era ended up still extending for another like 50 years. But it did kill that king off and really led to reforms when it came to royals. So we're going to divert from Authorania for a second to an independent kingdom called Belhajaer. So you can see Belhajaer's flag is up there. And this is Belhajaer. So Belhajaer is built in an abandoned mine shaft that collapsed hundreds of years ago. So before Authorania even existed here, there were mining elves that mined out this mountain. And once they mined it, basically completely hollowed it out, the mines ended up collapsing in on themselves and making a huge crater in the middle of the mountain. And the Belhajaerians ended up building their kingdom in the middle of it. So Belhajaer is actually known not only for its unique place, it's in the middle of this hollowed out mountain, but it is also known as the capital where money is made. So it has a massive gold smelting factory in which it makes gold nuggets, gold bars, and it also makes coinage. So that gold from the last part I talked about that you can exchange at banks, it makes that as well. And it all comes from Belhajaer. So Belhajaer is actually quite wealthy due to this. So down here is the foundry. It's closed, obviously, but we'll bypass the gate. And yeah, all of the gold in the mortal world for Authorania, the Azarath nations, and even Pelorium, which will be in part 3, is made here. So here is the massive smelt where the gold is melted down. And then here is a gold mine. They also store gold. So how it works is that other kingdoms like Authorania or the Azarath nations, etc., they will bring their gold to Belhajaer, who will smelt it and make it into coinage or do whatever, and then send it back for a fee. And the fee is actually quite small. And the reason why other nations rely on Belhajaer is because their smelting refinery and foundry is so well made that other kingdoms would just spend too much money making it as good. So it's just cheaper for them to have Belhajaer smelt their gold for them. This is the glow lamp district, so it's the same as a red lamp district. So this is where usually when red lamp districts are for, this is where that happens. You see, this is the central house. Kind of gives you an idea of what goes on in this part of town. I'll float up and show you what Belhajaer looks like from above. So you can see I hollowed out this mountain with TNT and built a kingdom inside of it. So I actually built Belhajaer twice. So I built, the first time I built it, I got it completely done, and then my hard drive corrupted, and I ended up losing it. And then a few years later, I was just did not want to rebuild it. So a few years later, when I was kind of over it, I really liked this idea, so I built it again. And this time I made many backups just in case. So up on the mountaintop here, there are farms that provide food for the kingdom, and then this is where the royals live. Alright, let's continue on our Authorania journey. So the next city-state is Cannerberry. So Cannerberry is a unique city-state in that it is actually royal land, so the royals own this land. Much like Capital City, citizens are not allowed to live in this land, only the royals. So all of these buildings here were built with the purpose of serving the royal family and the palace. So this is Canterbury Palace. This is where the king and queen and all of the royal family of Authorania live. Here is the throne for the king. Here's the royal's bedroom. And a little study up in the attic. So, like I said, Canterbury Palace was built by a corrupt king who did not want to live in the old palace over there, and he basically bankrupted the country building this. Kind of a world-building fun fact. There are those banners up there that are red and yellow for the actual banner of Authorania. And Authorania's original banner was yellow with a black cross. But when I made these banners up here, it ended up kind of looking like a B, and I did not like that, so I changed the colors. So the reason why Authorania's banner colors are red and yellow is because of those banners up there, funny enough. There is a little garden back here. And we can just go around that garden this way. Up here is a rooftop library. There's also where weapons are forged for the guard. This is also the guard's room. And there is a chapel up here. And the priest lives here. So, there are no chapels in Canterbury except for the one that's actually in the palace itself. And this is not run by a priest, it's actually run by a plurian or higher, which is interesting. Almost all churches are ran by priests. That is their job, is to run churches. Plurians are there to manage churches in a city-state. And then high priests are basically the head of the religion. There's only a few of them that exist at one time, and they all live in Capital City. That's a closet. Another bedroom for the prince or princess. Little balcony. And then here is the dining room, in which we went over the bridge up there. And the kitchen is down here. The closet. That's where they cook. The closet. So yeah, that is Cannerberry Palace. So the next city-state is Edinburgh. So Edinburgh is the second city-state that was established after the Blood River War. Now, Edinburgh is interesting because it was its own kingdom at the time, in which Jiagnotvershire was more of a village. But this is actually its own kingdom. And it did not like being absorbed into Authorania as a city-state. However, it needs to be a city-state because of Authorania's connections and its money and stuff like that. But Edinburgh still has its own kind of unique independence to it, so it doesn't really participate in Authoranian politics. It very much keeps to itself. And it basically acts as its own kingdom, even though it is actually a city-state of Authorania. So here is the castle that the head of Edinburgh lives at. Here's a large dance hall. Back room. Oops, fell off the stairs. Various bedrooms up here. And then an attic. Here's the dining room. But yeah, Edinburgh is mainly known for the fact that it is kind of its own thing when it comes to the city-states. It also has a large port called Port Bartholomew, which is over here. And this is a port town. There's a ship. We're going to float up to get to the next city-state. So this city-state is Sovenshire. So Sovenshire is where the Genevians come from, which is Authorania's special operations unit. This city-state is unique in itself, in which it has a very strong warrior culture. So it is much like real-world Sparta, in which all male citizens are part of the military and they're trained from a very young age to be militaristic. And they spend their whole lives being part of the military. And due to this, they are an extremely strong fighting force. They really proved themselves during the Bloody Trees War. They are basically what held the Azrathians at the border of the Forbidden Forest and Capital City. But they also practically won the Blood River War as well, because the Genevians invaded Presbytopia while they were occupied on the front lines and ended up taking Knightshire, which is Presbytopia's capital, which routed the soldiers on the front lines, caused them to retreat, and the war was won for the Azrathan Authoranian military. So the Jernivians are named Jernivians after Jernivius, which is the god of war. So they have a church of Jernivius. This is a training camp, and this is also where the Septep Morum actually takes place. So that is the last training that a Jernivian must pass in order to become a Jernivian. So it's basically their final test, in which they spend most of their young lives preparing for. It's a large obstacle, and there's also a part where they're thrust into the woods where they have to survive. And overlooking the training camp is the palace. Called Halifax Palace. Here's where the king and queen live. This is their room. There's also a ballroom here. A little courtyard area. So the Jernivians, they are a special operations unit of Authorania, but they do not actually follow the Authoranian military's command structure. They're their own thing, even though they technically are part of the army. So that's an interesting fact about them. Alright, so this is the next city-state, and this is what I'm currently building. So this is my most recent build, and it is nameless, so there's no name to this city-state yet. You can see everything is hollow. I haven't even put windows in yet. This is my newest build, and my last city-state that I'm building for Authorania, and then once this is all done, Authorania is done. So this city-state is supposed to be the link to the Levantine Sea, which is the Levantine Sea. And this is what basically connects Authorania to the rest of the world. So it is a port city-state, so this is where ships come in, this is where ships are built, this is where they are maintained, this is where they port. All that sorts of stuff. There is a Pelorian heavy frigate here, the PS Peridum. We'll go over Pelorium in Part 3, as I've said. And then this is a ship of the Authoranian Transcolonial Trading Company. So Authorania and Pelorium both have trading companies that deal with trade between the Langenmeyer continent, which is the continent we're on right now, and the Vidalian continent, which is the continent up north, which we'll go over in Part 3. The Authoranian Transcontinental Trading Company actually facilitates trade between Authorania's colonies in Vidalia and Authorania itself. So yeah, not much to talk about when it comes to the city-state. It doesn't even have a name yet, but it is my most current project. So we're just going to move on. So we have ended the tour of Authorania itself. So those are all the city-states of Authorania. Now we are moving on to some states that are around, independent states that are around Authorania. This is Galacia, and it has a twin kingdom. Of Antillia. So Galacia and Antillia are interesting kingdoms because they are actually old Authoranian kingdoms. So they were founded by Authoranians, and due to this, they speak a older version of Authoranian. So due to their seclusion from Authorania, many years ago, during one of the other phases of the Authoranian language, they speak their own version of the language. So Antillian is an Authoranian-derived language, which is understandable from the point of view of Authoranians, but Antillians cannot understand Authoranians very well. And then there is a ruined palace up there. So like I said, these are twin kingdoms. They used to be one big kingdom, and then they split many years ago due to a schism between two princes who couldn't agree on who would become king of the small kingdom. So they split it in half, and they both became kings of their own sections of the kingdom. Alright, we're going to move on to the next area. So this is Aldyyr. And Aldyyr is built atop this mountain up here. It is also built around, if I'll float up, a giant skull. So in part 1, I mentioned the Vescovan head, which was believed to have been built by a race of giants, which are long extinct. And the proof of giants' existence is their bones. So this is one of the examples. Is a skull that Aldyyr decided to build around. So Aldyyr is a pretty quiet kingdom. It has a unique religion which actually believes in dragons. So it believes in a pantheon of dragons, and that each dragon does something to the world or to people's lives differently. So what Aldarians will do is they will have little effigies or even little statues of dragons that do stuff for the world, and they will bring them around for to kind of harness that dragon's aura or what they actually do. So, for example, if a woman is going to give birth, she will have an effigy or a little statue of the dragon of childbirth, who will look over the pregnant mother and will hopefully help in a successful delivery of the child. Aldyyr also has a giant worshipping cult, which you would expect, being that it's built around a giant head. And this is their church. So, Order of the Skull Cathedral. And it actually has a doorway into the skull, so you can look inside of it. So this is its own religion in Aldyyr. But primarily Aldarians believe in the dragon religion. So they have a dragon that goes across their large bridge here. And here's the Palace of Aldyyr. Has a massive window which overlooks the land. It also has a very nice view of the sunset. So this is a small independent village of Engleshire. It is completely self-sufficient. And it is just a small farming village. So this is the Kingdom of Ellisland. So Ellisland is unique in that it is the only independent kingdom to exist that used to be part of Authorania. So Ellisland was founded as its own independent kingdom, but Authorania ended up taking it over, and it absorbed it into its government and made it a city-state. Well, due to poor treatment of Ellisland, especially during the Dark Era, Ellisland ended up having an independence movement in which they actually won independence from Authorania and split off into their own kingdom. Now, during the Dark Era, a few city-states actually broke off in order to become independent kingdoms, but they either went bankrupt and completely dissolved, such as the former city-state of Osgard, which went independent and then it couldn't recoup its finances and it ended up failing, or it decided to come back as a city-state of Authorania. But Ellisland has survived all these years independently. And the reason why Ellisland was able to survive independently is due to its farming network. So Ellisland has a large farming population which produces meat and crops, and their biggest buyer is actually Aldyyr. Due to Alldyr's position on top of the mountain, they cannot sustain themselves on farming or any meat because they do not have any farms. So they actually buy most of their food from Ellisland. So Ellisland, the whole middle part is all farms, and then on the mountaintops around the savannah are different districts. So there's a district over here, there's a district all the way over there. Ellisland is extremely proud of their independence. They actually celebrate it quite a lot. There are quite a few holidays. But due to Ellisland being a former city-state of Authorania, it actually has a lot of culture from Authorania. So they believe the same religion, they speak the same language, although there is a specific Ellislandian dialect of the Authoranian language that they speak here, but it's practically the same. Unlike the other city-states, whose independence was quite bloodless, Ellisland's independence did result in a war. So Ellisland is the only one of the former city-states that actually engaged in a war with Authorania, in which Authorania lost. So you can see that there is a large statue, and they built this statue when Ellisland gained independence. So we'll go through one of the districts of Ellisland. So this is the main market district of Ellisland. So most of the markets exist here. You can see there's stores flanked on each side of this long road, which is nice and wide in order to facilitate travel along it by horse and carriage. And then these niches here are all independent stores as well. At the end of this bridge is a large park where Ellislandians can come in and enjoy. So some world building behind the scenes when it comes to this park. I originally took this all out in order to build on top of it and add another part of the district, but I just was too lazy. And I knew I would never actually finish it, so I ended up just making it a park, going the lazy route. So here's a side view of that long bridge. And we'll explore some of the district here. This one has the Ellisland's main church. So that is Ellisland. So we'll venture on over to the next area. So this is Nektorias Major. So Nektorias Major is a maximum security prison. It is actually a multinational maximum security prison. So all countries from around the mortal world, especially Azarath nations and Authorania, will bring some of their worst of the worst criminals to rot away in this prison. Most of the mortal world's nations do not have their own prison systems, so this is really just a dumping ground for criminals that don't have the right to go back into society. So Nektorias Major is called Nektorias Major because it was designed by a guy whose last name was Nektorias, and this is the big maximum security prison that he built. There is also Nektorias Minor, which we will go over in part 3 because it's near Polorium, but Nektorias Major was built by an architect, and he built one of them. And the behind-the-scenes building reason why this is actually called Nektorias Major is because I originally was going to build Nektorias Minor down over here, next to Nektorias Major. I was going to make a smaller version, but just like with me putting a park at the end of that bridge, I just wasn't into building it. I made the footing and made the outline, and it stayed there for years. I was like, oh, I'll come back to it. And I just never did, so I destroyed the old footing. And then later on, quite recently, probably about a year ago, I built Nektorias Minor properly, but that was years after this was built. But we'll go inside, because it's actually quite interesting. So the middle of the tower has all of these cells, which have prisoners inside of them. Then at the very top is where the actual owner of the tower sleeps and lives. So, basically the warden. But the above ground part of Nektorias Major isn't all of Nektorias Major. Actually, most of the prisoners are located underground. So we'll go under Netground now. So Nektorias Major is quite labyrinthian, and it's designed like this on purpose in order to prevent escapes. So prisoners that are trying to escape will not be able to find their way around very easily. So we'll come back to this room last. Here are some cells on the side. You can see that they just leave the dead bodies in the cells. Here's some more cells. So this is where the bodies will be hung up. I wish we can have full skeletons, because I would have them hanging by their hands up there. And then the guards actually sleep back here. And this is where the head guard sleeps. Some more rooms, and then there's a large pit where they dump bodies down, so you can see all the skeletons down here. And then here are individual rooms for higher ranking soldiers. And then the last room is just a large room of prison cells. This is where a lot of prisoners are. 2 bunks per room. So one of these cells actually has a secret. So if we go into this cell, say that we are a prisoner. Now we're locked in, we can't get out. But we can go behind this painting. There's a door back here. There is a sewer that they were able to tunnel into. So prisoners sleep down here if they'd like, or they can escape altogether by continuing on. So you just click this button and run your way out, and now you are out. We're in a graveyard, the old prison graveyard. But this specific grave has a way out. So yeah, that is Nektorias Major. So the next thing that I'm going to show, I'm actually just going to warp to, because it is quite a journey to actually get to. So we'll warp there now. So you can see that there is a giant skeleton here. And this is what is called the Oasis Skeleton. It's called the Oasis Skeleton because what the skull has is it has a large hole in the back of its head, and it collects rainwater from the clouds above that the rain ends up evaporating before it hits the desert floor, but due to it collecting in the skull, it goes through its eye sockets and rains down on a specific part of the desert, and it created a little oasis. So this is the most complete of giant skeletons that exist in the mortal world, from the hips up. And yeah, just float up and look at it. So this skeleton took me an extremely long time to build. Figuring out how to build the skull at an angle like that was a pain, and I still think the skull doesn't look fantastic, but it's the best I can do. the most impressive giant skeleton in the mortal world. And then here's the hole in the back of its head, and its head is full of water. Alright, now we'll warp to the next area. So we are north of Jiagnotvershire in the forest here. So you can see Jiagnotvershire is over there. There's this large bridge. Which leads to Ullridia. So Ullridia is a tribe that exists in the forest here, and it's been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. They built all of their homes either on the ground level or in the trees. Now, the interesting thing about Ullridia is it's a tribe. It is not an actual nation, it's not a kingdom, nothing like that. It is a tribe. And what makes it so interesting is that Ullridia has its own writing system and language. So, all tribes that exist in the mortal world, they do not have a writing system for their languages. They do have their own languages most of the time, but they don't have writing systems for it. But Ullridia, they were able to develop their own writing system. And their writing system is very straight-lined, and it was made to be carved into wood. So, old Ullridian, during its first phase of its writing, would be carved into stumps. But once Ullridia actually figured out how to make paper out of wood, which was basically just making extremely thin pieces of wood, they would scratch their language into the wood, which is the reason why it looks the way it does. So Ullridia is known for its language, because to be known as a proper nation, you must have a language that has a writing system. So most tribes do not have a writing system except for Ullridia. Thus, they are not known as actual nations, but Ullridia is one of those rare examples where it has a writing system, but it is not a nation. It is still a tribe. So the bridge that we went over was actually built from the remains of a large palace made by a neighboring tribe that doesn't exist anymore because Ullridia destroyed it when they went to war with it hundreds of years ago. And they decided to take apart the palace and build this bridge. Now, the reason why they decided to take apart the palace and build a bridge over it is because the tribe that went to war with Ullridia, they actually burned down Ullridia's palace. So Ullridia doesn't actually have a palace for its tribal leader. Its tribal leader just basically lives in a mansion. And that is because it was burned down. And the palace used to be on this mound here. So, some world building facts. The actual reason why the palace burnt down was due to myself. So I built the palace, and then I put a large fire pit in the basement just as something cool to have. But that fire ended up consuming everything when I was actually in the middle of building. I actually was building, and then I heard a lot of fire noise, and I was like, "What is this?" And I turned around, and there was flames everywhere. So I accidentally burned the palace down, and instead of rebuilding it, I decided that it was a cooler story to actually have that burn down, the neighboring tribe burn down the palace story. But underneath this mound, the reason why it is a mound is because I do still have the basement. So there was a fire pit in the middle here, in the middle of where this table was, and that actually burned down the palace by mistake. So yeah, that is Ullridia. So we're back in capital city of Authorania, and we're going to continue to the next area, which is Cobblestone Road. So Cobblestone Road is much like the Horizon Road of the Azarath nations. It is a very long road that connects several nations, and Cobblestone Road actually connects Authorania to Poloria. So we'll travel there.